despite the horror that's done. Yeah, it's hard to read and it's tough to visualize, but it still just feels beautiful. The Gospels tell the greatest story ever told. Jesus Christ, God become man who suffered and died to save us. But despite being a cradle Catholic, I've never read them all the way through, and that changes now. Join me as we journey through the life of our Savior, his words, his miracles, and his sacrifice like never before. So chapter 26 is a fairly long chapter. There's a lot covered and it moves really fast. For the sake of trying to keep these videos somewhat short and digestible, I'm not going to go through everything, but essentially what's covered here is the Last Supper, Passover, Judas betraying Jesus, him being arrested, and him being tried. And there are a couple things that just really stuck out to me while I was going through this. One is clearly the Lord's Supper, the words we hear in Mass every Sunday. Jesus took bread and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." I mean, I pretty much knew that this came straight from the Gospels, but to see it and read it clearly does provide some clarity while we're going to Mass every Sunday. This is truly what Jesus said. Jesus also foretold Judas's betrayal, and he foretold Peter denying him 3 separate times before the rooster crows. He knows not only what's coming, but exactly what's coming, which shouldn't serve as a surprise considering he is God. But there's just something about how Peter can deny it and said, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all the disciples said the same, but Jesus knew that this would happen anyway. So they're finally understanding it, but they seem to still be denying it, if that makes sense. Like, okay, we hear you, we understand your words, but we're still not gonna let that happen. And then we have Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. It feels interesting to me that it's included that Peter and the disciples kept falling asleep while he was praying and he asked them to stay awake. Like in the grand scheme of things, that all seems so minor. So I wonder what the extra context or rationale behind including an entire paragraph about that. So I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts about that. I'm sure it's important. I guess I just don't fully understand the importance of it. Then we have the betrayal and arrest of Jesus. Judas comes and kisses him on the head and then they arrest him. I also don't know why this needed to happen. They already knew who he was and he even calls them out on that. "Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples left him and fled. First of all, they're all betraying him here. They're all fleeing. They're all running away. They're all scared. But he's right. Why did Judas need to identify Jesus? They already knew who he was. They've seen him teaching day after day. Then they brought him to Caiaphas, the high priest, for a trial. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said so, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has uttered blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need?" And again, they were just trying to trap him. But this time, even though he knows what's going to happen, he's going to do his Father's will, and he knows what his Father in heaven's will is. And so that's why he's letting this happen. And then we have Peter denying him 3 times, just like Jesus foretold would happen. The crowds are rambunctious. People are angry. People are pissed. They're going after Jesus, and people confront Peter and they say, "Wait a second, you're with him, aren't you? Aren't you one of his disciples?" And Peter denies him not once, not twice, but 3 times, just as it was foretold he would. And then as soon as he hears the rooster crow, his reaction is pretty interesting. And Peter remembers the saying of Jesus, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. He had a realization. He almost didn't realize that he was denying him in that moment. He was so caught up in everything that was happening in front of him. But it didn't strike him until he heard the rooster crow. That was almost like the bell in his ear. I said I would never do it. I said I would die with him before I would deny him, and I just did it 3 times. So that's a lot from chapter 26, but we are ending this, so this is going to cover a lot, I'm sure, in the next 2 chapters as well. And chapter 27 is a really, really heavy one, and it's kind of gruesome. I think it's more gruesome than I expected for Matthew. We start with Judas hanging himself for the guilt. He even tried to return the 30 silver that they gave him. They said, "It's blood money, we can't take it," so they buried it. Jesus goes before Pilate, who asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You have said so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he gave no answer. It's just, he's pretty clever with his word choice here. So Pilate said, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. It's interesting to me that the word amazed is used, not like shocked or disappointed or upset or anything like that. It's the word amazed, which seems pretty significant. And growing up, I always thought that it was essentially the Romans that crucified Jesus. And while they were in charge of the actual crucifixion of Jesus, you can't say they're fully to blame here. You can't even say they share most of the blame. It seems like Pilate is indifferent about it. Romans were motivated by order and peace. They didn't want uprising. And so he kind of just gave in to the high priest's demands, because the high priest's demands became the people's demands. So also the chief priests and the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the king of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him." And if he did that in that moment, I do wonder what their reaction would have been. It probably still would have denied him. They probably still would have said, "You used some trickery to get out of this. You're still not who you say you are." And Jesus finally perishes and dies from this torture of crucifixion after what sounds like 9 hours, the way Matthew writes it. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I need more context on this one.
God placed the sins of the world on his son. And Jesus, for a time, felt the desolation of being unconscious of his Father's presence. It was at that time that he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. It could be that Jesus' intent in quoting Psalm 22:1 was to point his hearers to that psalm. When they read Psalm 22, they would no doubt see the many fulfilled prophecies included in that Song of David.
There's a lot there. I mean, one, again, he's fulfilling a prophecy. Two, he's taking on the burden of sin of all of humanity. So when you first read it, it comes off like he is angry with God, even though he's fulfilling his will, which I suppose could still be a natural human reaction. Even, I don't know, it's still just, it's hard to grasp, fully God, fully human. But yet again, he's pointing to a fulfillment of the scriptures, a fulfillment of the prophecy. Is he's not abandoning them, he's fulfilling them. But what happens next, I'm sure put the high priests in a pretty tough spot. "And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, 'Truly, this was the Son of God.'" It's just unfortunate that it had to come to this for them to realize that, despite everything he did and everything he said along the way. So Jesus was buried, and people wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to pull some magic trick where the disciples will go and grab his body and then they can say, "Oh, well, see, he's risen from the dead." So they literally put a Roman guard out there by the tomb and sealed it and made sure it was shut. This is interesting context for Matthew to include, because it's very important to history to understand the facts of these actual events, that not only was he confirmed dead, not only was it for 3 days, but they also had ensured that it was sealed by the Romans and guarded by the Romans so that no one could sneak in and pull some thievery or some trickery. And 28, things finally come to an end. Jesus is resurrected from the dead. "And the angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him.'" But then the guard goes and reports everything, because they saw the angels too. "And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men." They ran to the high priest, told them, and then they were probably worried that they were going to get in trouble. So the high priest and them came up and concocted a story that his disciples came and stole them. And Matthew including this again for factual history is really important. He's addressing the questions and the skepticism that's going to be asked before it's even asked, before it's able to be asked, because this is what a lot of people probably think while reading the story of Jesus Christ. And he directly addresses that. "Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted." Who is still doubting? I know we have doubting Thomas, I think is Thomas's nickname. So I'm assuming it's him, but this says some is still doubting. I'm hoping the other gospels go into more detail about this, because that's just wild to me that they're still doubting at this point, despite seeing him right in front of them with their eyes, which is probably what they would have demanded to say, "Oh, that's proof enough to me. He can do anything and everything right in front of your eyes," and people still do not believe. The story, specifically these 3 chapters of his death and resurrection, I thought they would be difficult to read, and in some ways they are, imagining what happened and the description and imagery that's used. And I've seen Passion of the Christ, so that is stuck in my mind too. There's something that's beautiful about all of this. There's something that feels reviving, renewing about reading this, despite the horror that's done. Yeah, it's hard to read, and it's tough to visualize, but it still just feels beautiful. Jesus died for our sins on the cross, and 3 days later was resurrected and is seated at the right hand of the Father. This is the fundamental truth of Christianity. So despite it being difficult to read and to think about, it's still a beautiful ending to Matthew's gospel. We start Mark tomorrow. I'm curious to see the differences, the similarities. We'll be able to compare and contrast. And this has already been quite the journey, because right now I feel like we've gotten through the full story of Jesus. Now we'll get to see more detail, more imagery, different perspectives of it. And I'm really looking forward to continuing this journey with you guys.